We got a new clock, the other one kept on dying.
Is that in the budget?
$10 from Ace.
So it's the same as the old one that would.
The same
Look at
brand.
the box and I'm like, here, should I take this? back?
Ooh.
Jeff's like, we should take it back, you know? Yeah.
Good see you.
You know, the least controversial things in the city are what?
One of the biggest.
Where's online?
Yeah. how about-
I'm just.
Everybody.
So. All right, 7 o'clock, call this meeting to order. We pledged tonight. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Roll call, please.
Yes, Matt McGarrett.
I'm here.
Jamie Melky.
Here.
John Leo.
Here.
Nancy Rondell.
Here.
John Cox. We do have a quorum.
Very good. Any public comment before we get into our budget meeting?
Real quick, this is Officer Spencer Bishop. Our newest officer replaced Steve. He came from Grand Traverse County, but his mother and his grandparents have lived up here at the corner of Houston and Cemetery for 30-some years. He had 6 years in Grand Traverse County, and I feel like we stole him. It was a good, he has experience. He's born and raised in Saline, correct?
Yes.
But spent a lot of summers here, worked at, where, Birchwood?
Yep.
And so he's got experience with locals, and so anything you can explain it better than I can.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, this is like, he works next Monday, he's not working, so I thought, just so that you know who he is. It's funny because he went up to the high school to a basketball game last week. And the students up there, because you guys haven't seen him, and they haven't seen him, they told the Engelhardt, they said, I don't think he's a Harbor Springs police officer, go ask him. So at least if you run into him, you know he's one of us, so. But no, we're blessed to have him, and hopefully they'll stay here for a long time, so.
Yeah.
He has a girlfriend, hopefully soon a fiance, Adriana, that's moved up here with him, so.
Yep.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Yeah, we're having the honor to be here.
Did you stay half the night at Kyle's house the other night, or did you go home at a decent hour?
No, he was there. All the youth was there, all the young kids.
That was a good time.
You get one full year under your belt, you'll be the center of the roast.
Oh, boy. At one point, I was like, oh, boy.
Welcome to the crew, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, any other citizens comment?
Thank you.
No, perfect. And with anyone's got their hand up on the computer, so
Nope.
let's do the budget.
Yeah, so I'll first start with a presentation of the budget, and then we can open the hearing, public hearing, for the public comment, close the public hearing, and then council discussion. All right, so the
Really boring stuff, FYI.
2023 proposed budget. It's a little misleading title. It's also included in it is the amended 2022 budget as well. So at the end of the year, we amend the 2022 budget for what we had projected last year, and then we do a proposed 2023 budget. So that's really what we're looking at here, but most of the focus here is on 2023 in this presentation. Went over this last year, but it's always good to review what our goals are with budgeting. And first thing we want to remember is we want to cover the cost of our existing government services and operations. That's the first thing we're looking at when we budget. The second thing is we want to maintain and replenish our fund balances to cover the services and operations due to any unexpected losses in revenue or an emergency situation. So, for example, if some years we are seeing deficits, we want to make sure that we have following years where we're seeing surpluses so we can replenish those reserves. And the same thing is true for reserve funds for capital infrastructure projects. We'll get into this in detail a little bit more about potentially setting up some policies to address this, but when we talk about capital infrastructure projects, we have those necessary projects that we think of as replacing roofs, repairing parking lots, and in many eyes, the boardwalk, as well as desirous projects. And one that I can think of this might be coming up in the next several years is Kiwanis Park, some upgrades there. So make those distinction between necessary and desirous projects. Like I said, we'll get into it later, but there's a difference between operating budget, which is we combine it all in one in our general fund, where we have our capital needs and our operating needs all in one fund. So it's hard for people to go through that line item and distinguish what's a capital project and what's just an operating expense. But really, the capital expenses are those things that we buy, that we acquire, that can depreciate or it'll increase its value over time. Whereas operating budget is really what it takes to plow the streets, plow the sidewalks, to cut the grass, to pick up the leaves and brush, et cetera. So there's a distinction there that it's hard to see looking at our budget with the thousands of line items, but it's in there. So we'll get into it a little bit more later. But so talking about some of those significant changes to our budget. Normally, our budget is going to see some minor fluctuations on a year-to-year basis. One of the reasons for that is we anticipate inflationary increases, right? So we're looking at, all right, what's it going to be cost to supply those materials and that labor for that same exact service that we provided this year. So, this year, we obviously see a CPI of 8%, and almost, and, we're having capital, the CPI for taxes is capped at 5%. So, there's still some increase there that, we're going to expect in expenses that we have to account for. Other things that we look at is, projections for revenue. Maybe, we look at some of our planning trends and our zoning trends and think, well, maybe this year we're going to see more permits, or maybe this year we're not going to see as many permits. Same thing with the waterfront fund when it came to our docks, slips, and moorings. It's like, well, during COVID, we're like, well, we don't know, is it COVID going to increase the number of boats and money we have coming in, or is it going to decrease it? So we try to make projections based on past trends and what we think is happening in the future, but these are really all is proposed. It's all estimates, and by the end of the year, which is why we amend the budget in 2022, it's like, all right, well, projections were a little off. Maybe they were under, maybe they were higher, but that's the whole purpose. Again, we are projecting our operating expenses to be generally in line with 2022's. Of course, there's obviously your inflationary increases, but we also anticipate that a few capital projects in some of our funds will show some differences in deficits and surpluses compared to 2022, like the boardwalk, for example, if that's something we can do in 2023. So the general fund, what are the major revenue changes in the general fund? And we are expecting $800,000 more in revenue compared to 2022. And the major increases there are the $600,000 in donations, the majority from the boardwalk, and about $270,000 almost from the skate park. We have collected $245,000 for the skate park, but that's with the Petoskey Community Foundation, Petoskey Harbor Community Foundation. So we haven't received that money in yet into the general fund as a donation. We will receive it in when we do the project in the spring.
But it is a firm commitment.
It is, yeah, no, that is money. Yeah, exactly. We also received approximately in 2022, $100,000 in donations for the boardwalk. We're anticipating at least getting $300,000 in 2023 for the boardwalk. We hope we can get up to that $600,000 in total, but to be conservative, we estimate a little lower on how much we're gonna get. So we're not overestimating or committing ourselves to projects if we don't have the money to do them. We're also estimating $316,000 for the public safety millage, 90,000 more in the operating millage, which comes with that inflationary increase of CPI of 5%. And then $74,000 from the schools for the police, the contract we have with them to share the 3/4 of the cost of the police school resource officer as well as for the crossing guards. The decreases that we see compared to last year is last year we transferred in $125,000 from the historical fund, the museum, Andrew J. Blackburn Museum. Obviously, we're not transferring that money in. We'll have a discussion about when and whether or not to transfer that money out back to the historical fund. Then also about $95,000 in fire protection fees. And that's because I think there was a double, was there a double payment?
Yeah, when you look line item to line item, we might see it's 0 for X year and then double the next year. That means that the payment didn't come in or get made until January 3rd.
Yeah.
So it doesn't imply that it was necessarily delinquent, it was just timing to when you got the check.
Correct.
Yeah. So that's why you see a decrease in protection fire fees as revenue, but it's not really a change in our operating fire operations. From the expenditures changes, and I'll go through the explanations in detail afterwards, but we see a decrease in city hall expenses. In police department expenses, we see an increase over what we approved or projected in 2022 and a decrease from our amended, and I'll get into that. We see an increase in planning, an increase in zoning, parks and grounds, trees, and other functions, and these are essentially all to capital projects. So the city hall decrease that we see is in 2003, we bonded to remodel, or really reconstruct these city hall and the police department buildings. That bond was for a period of 20 years. Over those 20 years, it might be a little bit more than this, but we paid approximately $1.5 million. Starting in 2023, we will no longer have to pay that roughly $75,000 annual debt principal. So we see a decrease in that line item because we're no longer paying the debt on these two buildings. For the police department, we had originally projected in 2022 that the police costs would be around $884,000. However, a senior officer's retirement, which Spencer has replaced, which was Steve Timmons, added significant expense to the police department, bring that 22 costs over $1 million for 2022. Obviously, we don't have retirements of an officer who's worked here for 38 years every year. And we didn't predict when Steve was going to retire. We knew it was coming up soon, but we didn't know whether it was going to stay 40 years or 38 years. So we had that expense. But for 2023, we're proposing a budget of around $973,000, which includes money for capital outlay projects as the digital chalking equipment, replacing the old office computers, and replacing the officers' older uniforms with newer uniforms. Planning and zoning. We are planning on purchasing new planning and zoning software, which, as we were talking to the BSNA, which is our company that does the software, they also have updates for assessing as well. The software is basically going to transfer some of our operations to the cloud, to internet-based, and will also include new tools like tracking of complaints that the public can see and just better tracking for internally and other community development modules. We plan, this software would come with annual maintenance fees, but like we do generally with all annual maintenance fees and costs of new things, like we did with Harmari for tracking short-term rentals, is we pass that cost on through our fees and our through planning permits and zoning permits. And that way taxpayers don't absorb the extra cost to administrate or as much of that extra cost to administer this, the software.
Does the 15,000 include upload fees or installation fees, or is that just the software?
It includes, it includes like training and instruction and also guys, but I think the assessing part, if we go for the assessing part, could add a little extra cost of this $15,000. Then there's an annual maintenance fee, and we'll bring the quotes to you guys next year for selection, so we can see that in more detail. All right, skate park. The goal is to build a concrete skate park in the spring of 2023. We anticipate using donated money for building the park. That's what council agreed to, and council said they would do. We anticipate to have about 270 in donations by the time it's all done. We're at about 245, so we're, hopefully we can get another $25,000 maybe between now and the spring. And that will be expended in 2023. The other fix we need is $12,000 to replace the windows at the skate park, existing skate park building, which are quite outdated and leaky. So that's one cost. We did replace, I think, was it the doors?
A set of double doors to put the tractor in, yes.
Yeah, we already did that last year, so. All right, so the Parks and Grounds, the reason you've seen a huge increase in Parks and Grounds is because that's where we have itemized a capital expense for the boardwalk. So we're hoping that we can do a 2023 construction for the boardwalk. That's our goal. I mean, realistically, it could be the fall. I think spring might be too early, but we won't know until we bid it out. But we're anticipating that costs right now for the western half to be $600,000. That might be overly optimistic with the way prices have gone up, but that's what we projected earlier this year. So we're seeing a $600,000 as an expense in that capital outlay item. We as a city staff, Nick and I especially, we budgeted for $500,000 in donations, as I mentioned, 100 in 2022 and maybe 400 in 2023. We may not receive 400 in 2023. We may receive less. We may receive more. I mean, we're not sure, but that's what we're hoping to receive, to at least have a $500,000 in donations. With that, we propose then if we receive $500,000 in donations that, council could, commit $100,000 to a project if it costs us $600,000. If less, then less. If more, then we have to reevaluate, how much council wants to contribute from our budget as well as our reserve funds. As I mentioned earlier, regardless of what we receive in donations, we don't even know if a contractor will do it in 2020. It may not be to 2024. So that's another thing that we might not have this expense shown in 2023, even if we have the revenue come in, the donations come. I think it's unlikely the cost will come in significantly under $600,000. I'm hedging my best it'll come in more at more than $600,000. Though we may have some good news on overall bidding for things like we bid out the water towers and we got some bids because we had 7 or 8 bids with that we had some very competitive bidding, which gave us some very good prices. So if we have competitive bidding this time, as opposed to when we bid out the platform, we only had one come in, and so he could basically charge whatever because he was only a bidder. But anyway, so I'm guessing it's gonna be more than $600,000, but we're just not sure. So I think it's important to know how much non-donated money council is willing to contribute to this project. And I think it's probably best, after talking it over, that we wait until we know how much the bid costs, right, before we actually commit to any money, spending it in our budget, because we just don't know how much the bids are going to be. We could, or we should wait till we know at least a better idea of how much we have in donations coming. Going next, trees and bluff side management. We are proposing 14,000 more in 2022 to focus more on maintenance of our existing tree canopy. We have, and this is tree canopy maintenance that's not related to interference with our electrical utilities, but just in general, maintaining the trees that we have, watering them, pruning them, spraying them, keeping them healthy. And we also need to should start updating a slow update of our urban tree inventory and assessment. We've talked about at the tree board and staff about doing, a certain amount of the tree inventory a year instead of doing just one whole big, large inventory in 1 year and have this large expense, that we should be going continually looking at our inventory and updating it with trees, assessments of trees, especially looking at trees. And I know the tree board is also working hard, and Dan has been part of that, working hard on kind of getting plans together for what our streets and our streetscapes and our parks should look like with trees. And that takes time and takes money to eventually implement that. So, but we think that having more money for tree maintenance is really going to go a long way. So that way it costs a lot of money. We just had to spend $4,500 to remove a private tree that was threatening our museum. So, it takes a lot of money to remove a bad tree, but it doesn't take as much money to make sure a tree doesn't become quote unquote bad tree. So.
When was the last inventory done?
2015 or 14. 15, I think it was a 2000, yeah. Other functions, we've calculated 150, well, we've projected or proposed $150,000 transfer out to the historical fund. That is the money that we took in $125,000 last year to cover our deficit essentially, transferred it back in the general fund. And it's good to keep in mind that the money that's in that historical fund was money that was put in there by the general fund that we allocated $25,000 to $35,000 per year for the Blackbird Fund as a reserve in case anything happened in that building and to keep the operations going. So council last year said, all right, we'll borrow that 125, put that transfer to 125 into general fund so we can use it to cover some of our deficit. And then as need be, we'll transfer it in. It doesn't have to be transferred back in this year. Council said that they want to transfer that money back in the historical fund. We showed it on our transfer in. It doesn't have to be this year. But we do need to at least transfer in $25,000 to keep that museum open for the year and operating. We've had an agreement with the Historical Society for the remaining months of this year, from July through December, to operate it, keep it open 2 days a week and do some collection like management, but we'd have to enter into an agreement with them for next year to keep it open as well. Otherwise, we have to find a staff person to keep it open.
So that is yet to be negotiated.
That is yet to be negotiated, but based on what we did this year, I'm assuming it's gonna be about $25,000. It could be a little bit less, a little bit more, based on what we negotiate. The other transfer out in other functions was $62,000 for the water tower repair and repaint. And this comes from the fact that this was ARPA money, the American Rescue Plan money, that when we received that first, we're supposed to receive about $126,000, some or so, $125,000. When we received that first payment, it was required to be put in the general fund. Even though we're using it we're allowed to use it on the water project, it had to be put into our general fund. So now that we're gonna be doing that water tank repair project in the 2023, we have to show that transfer out from our general fund into the water project. So you'll see that coming out of the general fund, even though that's the ARPA funds, but we still have to show it as an expense.
It showed as revenue when it actually.
It showed as revenue when it came in. Yep. So our existing shows, because of all these large scale items, the transfer out of the water for the ARPA funds, the $100,000 I proposed for council to commit to the boardwalk, as well as $125,000 transfer out to the historical museum, we're showing a deficit of $140,000. However, we can hold off on transferring that money back to the Blackbird Museum, the historical fund, which would bring down the deficit for $15,000. We also, could commit less money or no money right now for the boardwalk until we get bids back. Then we could see a surplus of $85,000, and we could hold on to that $85,000 as capital spending for that boardwalk. And I think it's also, we talked about some line items that we could also reduce in our budget, such as one that we dismissed was parks operating supplies that we could bring down. We showed a carryover of $35,000, but we can bring it back down to like $20,000. So there's some areas we can definitely show that as a surplus, but the real big ticket items showing a deficit are the boardwalk spending, the transfer to this history museum, and the one that we have to do, which is the ARPA fund transfer. All right, so the bottom line is, and I just went through this here about the boardwalk and the Blackbird Museum and ARPA funds. Well, so those are all capital projects essentially. In a year without those expenses, combined with our added public safety millage, we could see, anywhere between a surplus of $100,000 and $200,000 a year just for operating, not thinking about capital projects. When we add the capital projects in, then that of course chips away at that surplus. So, some things we proposed, we bounced back and forth, and we've talked about it here at last year's budgeting, is we could create a capital reserves fund, which any surplus we have, or up to a certain amount, we put in this capital reserves fund. So when we have money in the future, we build up monies to maintain or repair or replace the boardwalk or fix these buildings, like the roofs in the next 5 to 10 years on these 2 buildings will have to be replaced. Parking lots, when they get in disrepair, we have to have money set aside. So that capital reserves fund could be built slowly through time, so that way we have money to make those repairs. Another thing we've talked about is keeping our fund balance, which is our reserves fund for the general fund, for example, at about 9 months operating. We'd like to see the 9-12 months operating, because for some reason, if something happens, we can't collect taxes, we have to keep the city going as much as possible. We would like to, the clerk and standard accounting practices anywhere from 6 to 12 months. Nick likes to see 9 months to be safe. So right now, we're at about 9.5 months when it comes to the general fund balance. We have, we're not including the capital projects. 9 months of our operating funds is about $2.5 million because our operating expenditures are about 3.1 million. So right now we have about 9.5 months. However, something to keep in mind is we only have 5 months of actual cash reserves. So that's only 5 months of cash. So that's not all in cash, that $2.5 million that we have in our or $2.6 million in our fund balance. It's assets and et cetera. So unless we just decide, we got to sell this asset to keep the city going, we'd like to probably see closer to 6 months of cash at hand. And that's, 5 months is not that far off of 6 months. It's just something that I don't know if
If I can just quickly interject on the cash is behind the scenes, it's important to how we operate because we only levy taxes June and December. But we're spending money all year long, so I need to be able to make sure I've got cash for when those taxes are coming in and replenishing on a weekly, monthly basis. So that's kind of why we're looking at 6 months, because we levied in December and we won't levy again until June.
And in reality, counting assets as part of that reserve is tricky because they're not liquid. If you
They're not
needed them,
liquid and we can't even sell them without a vote of the people anyway, so.
that's where I was headed. So looking at the cash and increasing the cash percentage makes perfect sense.
Right.
So based on this discussion, Nick and I were going to offer for next council meeting to bring to council 2 policies. One that would set up a fund balance for a general fund that we, talk about having 9 months in operating funds and reserves for emergencies. And then the other one is to start a capital reserves fund. And so this capital reserves fund policy basically would, as I mentioned, set up, this fund for projected maintenance and replacement of general fund infrastructure, which, as mentioned, boardwalk, city hall, police department, grounds and parks, buildings and infrastructure. Nick mentioned to me earlier that the sewer authority, they have a fund like this, a policy like this. It's called the repairs and replacement fund balance, and they set aside money each year for projected repairs. And so if, for example, just an example, had we for 35 years been saving, putting, $5,000 away for the boardwalk, you'd end up, would you have at least $150,000, or if you put more away for it each year. This is what the policy would do. So you would establish a minimum amount of money that you want in that fund, and then you would allow annual allocation of any surpluses in the general fund up to a certain amount to be put in that capital reserves. So once we reach that minimum in that capital reserves fund, what we would do is say, all right, let's say we had $100,000 in surplus. We could say, hey, you know what? Our policy is to put $40,000 or $50,000 away in this capital reserves fund. The rest of that surplus, we don't need to see for operating expenses. So it could have the effect of lowering the overall millage rate because we don't need to levy as much money because we have that extra surplus. So that's one of the advantages of that capital reserves fund is it allows us to set aside money when we need it. But if we don't need it anymore, then you just give that money back by not raising the taxes.
And the capital reserve is a flip side of us just paying off this debt. So when we needed to do something with these buildings, we didn't have the wherewithal to do it. We had to borrow money. Cost us $500,000 if we're forward thinking, boardwalk, whatever. Let's put the 70 grand that we've been paying in debt for 20 years or somewhere in between and have that instead of having to borrow going down the road.
Other funds, and I'm going to talk about the other funds in the CIP mostly because most of the significant cost differences in other funds are due to capital improvement projects. You'll see that we don't have any streets projects, I think, aside from our regular annual sidewalk replacement. So we're going to see like a surplus of $300,000 almost in our local street fund because we're not doing any street projects. So all the differences you see from last year to this year are due to capital improvement projects. So I always end this, or I ended it last year with, what's council's role and then, city manager, clerk, and the management team's role here is when it comes to the budget, right? Council's role is policy. So, what services and amenities does council want to increase, maintain, reduce, or eliminate? what projects does council want to do now or push off until later? And what kind of surplus deficit does council want to see, basically? That's like, are they okay with seeing a deficit or a surplus for this year? Our role then is, all right, to figure out, how we can work the budget to increase or maintain or reduce those services and operations that council wants. The city manager and clerk advise the council on the feasibility of actually finding the funds to do those projects or the consequences of delaying those projects. And then city manager and clerk add or reduce to the budget to meet council's goals. So your policy, and then we go back and we look at the books, the budget, and figure out how to make it work to fit your needs. So that is the budget, and we've been tagging on the capital improvements plan to our budget hearing just because it makes sense to do them together.
aren't
They don't have-
together, yeah.
They don't have to be done together, but we do them together because they all tie in together. So the 2023, the 2028 capital improvements plan. This is a 6-year plan for capital projects purchases over $10,000. We do this every year. So we had a 2022 to 2027 capital improvements plan last year. It slightly changed this year, and it will always change going forward. As we get closer to the year that we're doing the budgeting, we know more about the actual cost of doing that project and whether or not we're actually going to do that project. So sometimes in 2028, you'll probably see maybe 5 or 6 projects. 2023, you see maybe like 15 projects, just because, well, as time we notice what we have to do and when we have to do it. So this includes necessary projects and desirable projects. So this is why we do a scoring system that we'll talk about later. But there's projects that we feel we have to do for streets and electric and water. And then there's projects like parks and grounds that we say, these are desirous projects, that, they don't have to be done, but it's something that the council or the community has recommended or decided that they might want to do. The CIP does not commit the city to spending any money. That's the budget. The budget gives us the guideline for spending, what money we can spend for the year. The CIP is just a guide for basically, what we anticipate we need to spend year over year in what parts of our government, right? What parts of our community. This is a requirement for the Michigan Plan Enabling Act. So the Plan Enabling Act focuses particularly on structures, but we, to help us with our planning, we included the CIP things that aren't just like structures, like or infrastructure, like uniforms or things like that. We include that we are just over $10,000. That's our policy. If it's a purchase that's going to cost over $10,000, council wants to review it because it's considered a major purchase for the year. This must be approved by Planning Commission, which we received Planning Commission approval in November, and then final City Council review and approval. And must be adopted before the budget. So when next December 19th, you'll adopt this before you adopt the budget. Very quickly here, the timeline for it is in September, October, we have department heads submit projects to me, which includes information such as cost, timeline, project necessity, and proposed funding sources for that project. I then in October compile that information and distribute to a policy team. The policy team consists of a mix of staff and board members. We have the mayor on it, and as well as the Planning Commission chair, because they're both the heads of the bodies that approve it, and then DPW directors, since he oversees a lot of projects in a lot of different parts of government, city clerk treasurer, because obviously the manager knows about the money, and then myself. So that's our policy team, and we do the scoring, and then that scoring really basically allows us to see which projects are necessity, which are important, and which ones aren't. So if we end up in a situation where we don't have as much money as anticipated, well, then we just all right, we've identified that we need to do these projects because they're higher scored. That means they're more necessary. And these other projects that are lower scored, we say, what, we don't have the money for them, so we don't need to do them, or we can push them off. That's the whole point of scoring. November, basically, the policy team reviews the project, scores them. I compile that into draft CIP, present it to the Planning Commission, who approves it in November, and then council reviews and approves this meeting and the next council meeting. Overview, we have a total of 71 projects on our list, the total cost of $19 million. This is a minimum cost. It does not include unknown costs for one project. The average cost per project or purchase is about $270,000. And this, when I say average, you gotta remember it is an average, it's not a median cost. We got some high price projects like the substation that really bring this average high. And we have in our CIP, noted that we're seeking grants and donations for at least 9 of those projects, and those are mostly parks and grounds projects that, we'd like to fund with grants and donations more so than just taxpayer money if it's possible. And, we can't guarantee we're gonna get those grants or donations, but we hope to fund those projects with those grants and donations. Electric fund projects constitute about 2/3 of the overall anticipated spending in the next 6 years. However, even though it's not a huge deal, the CIP does not take into consideration small scale purchases. General maintenance, for example, if we need a new desk at City Hall, it's an asset, right? But it's not something that we're gonna, it's $500. It's not put on our CIP, but there, in our budget, you'll see, areas, you might see a capital outlay item. You might see, well, you said you guys are spending $100,000 on this capital outlay item, but I see 106 in the budget. What's that $6,000? It's for small little capital things that don't meet the threshold for $10,000 in the CIP.
Just a quick question, what's the limit to depreciate it? What are the rules say?
Depends on the fund. Obviously, electric and water sewer assets are much higher. I generally look at 25 grand as far as depreciation versus maintenance and repairs. If it extends the life of the asset, then we depreciate it, but general fund, general government assets, that depends, 15 grand. It's, if it's something that's gonna be there for 30 years, I'll capitalize 10 grand.
No, just kidding.
So generally, he's not gonna get a desk, but
Yeah, or a new computer, 20 years ago, we would have capitalized all the computers, but it's
Throw it
now,
all now.
we're just supplies.
so just to have a visualization here, the total number of projects that we're doing per fund, and the math seems funny. It shows 83 projects in this chart, higher than the report says of 71 projects we're doing. And that's because some projects are split between funds. So for example, the tree trimming project on the pine trees on M119 split mostly with the electric fund, but also partly with the general fund because the trees threaten our electric lines, but also park infrastructure. So we split the money. So you'll see that project gets put in twice. So it's a visualization. You can see most of the projects are within the general fund and the electric fund. And that's pretty common we have a large electric system that, 3,600 customers. It takes a lot to provide that. And as you see, it's even more obvious with spending. About 2/3, 12 million of that 19 million comes from the electric fund in the next 6 years. So that's really where the bulk of the money comes from. Always a good reminder that the electric fund is not paid for by tax dollars, but it is paid for by our residents' utility bills, who all our taxpayers pay our utility bills, but we also have people living in the townships who also pay that. So it's not tax money that goes to the electric fund, but it is residents and customers of that, our utility that pay into that $12 million. So a timeline, just looking at what our high expenditure years are. We're looking at 2024, and the main reason again for that is that's when we have the proposed substation. I don't know if it will actually come to fruition in 2024, only because transformers are on back order 2 to 3 years. There's only one company that actually does it in the United States. It's based in Pittsburgh. So there's really not much competition for it. And there's a lot of competition for that one provider. So there's a lack of engineers. There's a lot of supply chain and education issues with creating, helping preserve and maintain our grid. So there's a lot of back order on these things. So while we hope to get the substation done in 2024, there's still a lot more planning to left. We have to still go back to council, planning commission, bid it out eventually at that point, and then see how long it's going to take to actually get the materials to be able to run it. But in general sense, that substation, whenever you move that substation, that spike in the chart is going to follow whenever we do that substation, because with the lines and everything coming out, it's going to be $4 million plus overall. So I'm going to go over this quickly, not too in depth. We did it at the planning commission, but one of the goals was to see how our projects and if they align with the master plan goals, and this is just to show the residents and the planning commission council that these projects do align with the goals of the master plan, some more specifically than others. But for example, goal 1 was, Harbor Springs retain distinctive natural character defined by waterfront setting, substantial bluffs, clean air, et cetera. Well, Judd Hill Wall, you know, we have, that protects Judd Hill Street from the bluff. So, you know, we want to make sure we can preserve that bluff and preserve that road. So having Judd Hill Wall kind of fits into that goal, right? Same thing with the North FEMA project. That's, you know, assuring that our facilities up by DPW don't get flooded. So it's kind of creating flood mitigation. And that's something that project specifically, we originally we're trying to coordinate with the school and Irish Boat Shop because the flood would affect, if a flood happened there, affects all three of our properties. So it's something we hope to reignite again in the future, because if our DPW built facility gets flooded, it's you know, could be a serious issue. But anyway, so that fits into goal 1 in a little bit, as well as a vibrant community. One thing we have is underground electrical lines. People like amazing vistas and attractive streetscape. It is a goal. So, you know, underground electrical lines, that serves that goal. While underground electrical lines doesn't just serve the goal of aesthetics, it also is more beneficial for damage and wind damage to the wires. You won't have wind damage to utility poles if they're underground, but it does fit that goal as well. So goal 4 was about recreation facilities being convenient, located, exceptionally maintained, safe, and attractive. All these are considered recreation facilities, the boardwalk, Ford Park building, which we can talk about, I guess, a little bit later. We had some questions from council members about that windows replacement. Kiwanis Park upgrades, Cussaquat playground equipment, skate park windows replacement. Goal 5, unique collection of recreation opportunities, the projects that fit there. And you'll see repeats as other ones because they fit multiple goals. The boardwalk, Kiwanis Park, Cussaquat, tennis courts, observation deck, and the bike path. Harbor Springs in goal 7 will be comprised of viable community-oriented establishments that foster our resort and recreation theme. Amphitheater and Kiwanis Park upgrades are on that. Whether or not we go through with those or not, we don't know, but those meet that goal. Goal 9, we have Ford Park parking and West Dock pedestals to ensure that residents essentially enjoy a waterfront area that is integrated into and easily accessible from adjacent districts and neighborhoods. You know, so Ford Park parking is one of those accessibility parts of the goal, and then West Dock pedestals again is allowing people who use the docks to have, you know, safe and electric hookup, etc. Same thing with goal 10 about harbor development, should strive to maintain open views and support a sustainable level of human use. It's interesting when this goal comes, we always see people emphasize maintain open views, which is an important part, but it's also about being balanced with sustainable human use. So they both are supposed to be in consideration when we do this. So 2 goals that we have for that 2 projects is harbor master building renovation. And this took a evolution from back in 2014 or so when it was going to be a new building. You know, well, there was concerns about the costs and about, you know, state control language in the grants, and then about the views. So now it's kind of got downsized to, all right, what was the original purpose of this harbor master building? It's to get laundry facilities in there. So there's a remodel being proposed. It's much more smaller impact. So it allows us a sustainable level of human use that uses it, the boaters, and as well as still trying to maintain those open views. Well, there's differences of opinions on that, but anyway, that's the goal of the project, right? That's in theory. Goal 11 is about complete streets, safe, efficient, aesthetically attractive streets. Again, a lot of projects that align with that. You know, purchasing a street sweeper, replacing our sidewalks, the Little Traverse Wheelway, Judd Hill Wall, et cetera, et cetera. So those are all street projects. Again, goal 12 is about inviting a network of meaningful and non-motorized trails. Boardwalk replacement can be considered a trail, as well as a Little Traverse Wheelway. Goal 13 is more about the city staff delivering efficient, productive, and strategic public services consistent with needs. And it's a broad category, you know, and we put computer replacement. Well, how can the police department, you know, deliver that kind of efficient and productive public service if the computers aren't working? So it's one of those ideas that, you know, things that you see at City Hall that you might not see out there in the public, or things that kind of help us on the back end of operations. Digitizing our deeds, to chalking for parking enforcement, loader, plow trucks, police vehicles, police uniforms, wheel loader, and zoning administrative software. Those all can be lumped into providing those public services, some more clearly than others. And I'm not going to list all the goals for 14, but this is about utility services. And this is mostly water and electric projects, mostly electric, I should say. our goal is to provide abundant clean water, power, fuel, and communication linkages. So those are essentially all our utility projects. And then goal 15, we finally have is Harbor Springs will assume a leadership role in cooperating with regional, local, and state entities. And we are working with the state on a Pleasant View traffic light project update. They're updating the intersection at Pleasant View, and they needed our help to basically, they needed us, asked us, made us move our electric underground system. But we've actually worked collaboratively with them on it. We've gone back and forth about different issues we had, and we've come to an agreement on how to do it. But so that's that goal though, is we work collaborate with our partners on that. So that's the CIP, and maybe we can wait till questions after we do the public hearing. Yeah, that'll be fine. Okay, so that is my presentation, or my presentation. So Nick, if you want to call the, or somebody at the council want to call the public hearing, open the public hearing.
Go into the public hearing. Sorry.
You did made the motion, Mike. David Melky, John Leo.
Yes.
Nancy Randall.
Yeah.
John Cups, Matt McGuire.
Yes.
Public hearing at 7:44.
Do we have any public comment on the CIP or the budget?
Those first in the chambers, and then we can go to Zoom.
Well,
The digital talking, and John and I spoke earlier, that's one of those things like uniforms. Uniforms for us was actually on the 2022 CIP plan. And we put it off because we didn't know where we were gonna set for the village. And so we put that in 23, and the same with this, it's like, if we feel going to summer that this is something we need, then we will look to purchase it. If it's something that maybe we can get by another year with, see what happens down the road, we'll do that. Or it was the same with, we did that, Victor and I talked about the uniform, that was actually in last year's budget, and we held off because we didn't know where we were gonna set with the numbers. We'll do the same with that.
okay. Come on in, Margaret.
No, you're allowed.
Unless you have something to say.
I know there's a lot of information if you get down into the weeds on this budget, the line items. So even if you don't have an organized list of things that you want to question right now, we're always here. You can call me, email me, stop in, whatever. And we'll explain it to you or clarify whatever. Doesn't mean that any questions in here.
Is there anybody on Zoom that has any questions? Raise your hand, please. Questions, comments, thoughts? Yes, we have Kathy Macho. Kathy, you can go.
Can you hear me?
Hi, Kathy.
Hi. I just have 2 or 3 questions about the details of the budget. It's the time to bring it up.
Yes.
Okay. First off, I'm looking under the general budget. On the documents I got from you earlier today, Nick, under the city hall. It talks there about, and we discussed this before, the debt principal is paid off, so you won't have that in 2023. But why is there debt interest? This is under the city hall portion of the expenditures.
I do have one interest payment of between $300 and $3,500 that is due in April of 2023.
Okay. Okay, but then there wouldn't be any more, right? Because that debt's retired?
After that, going forward, after I make that small interest payment in the spring, then that section will probably drop right out of the equation, yes.
Okay. And then, thank you. I then on the police department budget, there's a pretty big, the payments in lieu of hospitalization are estimated to be 125,000 in 2022, which is more than the original budget, and then it's going to go back down. That's a one-time expenditure?
Yes, that is, correct me if I'm wrong, but that is because we had an officer who, I believe this is it, retired after 38 years, so he had a pretty substantial payout for his payout package essentially, so that's $60,000.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Okay.
that's exactly right, Kathy. we've got a couple unions in play here, and that's part of our thing is these guys, you know. He worked here for a good almost 40 years, so he earned some healthcare after retirement. So that.
I understand.
See go away, and then we'll be back down to a different, a more straight line number that.
Okay, so it's an unusual or one, well, not, maybe not one time, but a one-time expenditure in that regard.
It
Stan.
doesn't happen every year, no. That's
Right.
correct.
Right, absolutely, I understand. I don't think I have any other questions, thank you.
Thanks, Kathy.
Yeah.
Anybody else on Zoom? Bill Mulder.
Hi, Victor. Hi, Council and Nick. In terms of the streets budget, does the capital improvement plan use up the entire streets budget, or are there other projects that are going to be done in there?
The capital, if you look at major street fund, Bill. To start off with, which is 202 fund on page 12 through 14. We get money from the state from the motor vehicle highway fund, and that major street fund is a lot of it has to do with the maintenance and repairs of 119, which is a state trunk line. Plus our major streets in the city, whether it's Lake Road, some of the more populated near the schools and the central business district. And what is not covered by that motor vehicle highway fund is covered by a transfer from the local streets where the millage is collected to the major street fund if necessary. So in your question, you asked about capital outlays for street projects. We do not have any for 1 year in a lot of years. We do not have any capital projects for streets in 2023 other than our annual boardwalk or sidewalk construction. So as you can see, if you look in a different page in the back on the fund balance, we needed to take a year or two on our street funds to restore our fund balances up to a little healthier level. You know, a quarter of a mile street project can then run anywhere from $250,000 to $600,000, depending on what we're doing. I'm probably over speaking what you're asking, but hopefully one of those comments filled in a blank for you.
Yes, it did. And so do we have any major street projects on tap
No.
for 2023?
No,
Okay. Thank you very much.
Could have turned that answer down slightly, but
no, it's a
No,
good.
it's helpful to hear the background.
Any other comments? I guess one last call. Last call.
So,
No. Kathy,
No, I think Kathy, is that you again, or you just have your hand still raised?
Well, I did have another quick question.
Okay,
I'm sorry, I forgot. I think I'm under my 3 minutes. Yeah. Under just in a general question about the electrical fund. I thought I read something in the last couple of years that there was going to be a significant increase in electrical rates. I don't really see.
so yeah, Kathy, there is an increase in our electrical rates, but we spread them out over a few 5 years or so, 3 or 5 years.
3 to 5 years, so we didn't try to all at once.
right.
So
Okay,
It was like a 3%.
yeah, it was an overall 3%. So it wasn't, and that's something I should have brought probably more clearly to our attention, is we just did a business risk model assessment with the MPPA did a business risk model assessment of our fund, and compared to like Consumers Energy and Great Lakes Energy, we are about 45% lower in our rates, which is a good thing, right? It makes us competitive. However, that's because it's been so long since we actually raised our rates that we can't keep up. We haven't been able to keep up with some of the cost of our projects. So as Kathy said, last year we did institute a 3% overall increase over several years, and that we were going to look every 5 years or so at our rates to make sure that they're in line with the true cost to do business, but also while maintaining low cost for our residents, because that's the advantage of having a local utility is, you have that, not only do you have that local service for electricity, like the guys all live in this town, they can be here in 15 minutes, but also that by providing the service as essentially a nonprofit, basically is you don't have to charge those, and can't charge those high exuberant rates, so. But it's something to keep in mind, yes, we do, and that it is reflected, that small increase is reflected in our revenue, but it's relatively small.
Was that actually was part of that 3% in the 2022? No,
Yes, yes, it was.
okay, thank you, that makes sense then, I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Mayor?
Okay.
Need a motion to go out of public comment? I would make that motion.
Second.
All right, John Leo.
Yes.
Jen Cox.
Yes.
Matt O'Gara.
Yes.
Nancy Rondell.
Yes.
Jamie Melky.
Yes.
Out of public session at 7:54, 10 minutes.
Well, this year.
My presentation.
A long public comment.
Now it is on you guys to discuss anything that you want to change or like or don't like, or
And that's just a reminder, the major things that we talked about were for the overall general fund surplus / deficit is the boardwalk and the transfer out of the historical fund monies. And so those were two of the big ticket items of that can show whether or not we have a deficit or surplus, so.
So John went through it. They're fine tooth comb and found a few.
Well, Nancy, we went through a pretty detailed bullet today,
Yeah.
and that's where those items were they were highlighted. I don't think we should be running in a deficit environment. We should run balanced. If anything, given the passage of the millage and whatnot, we should really still be looking at expenses and where we can cut. And anything that shows up as a surplus should be reserved to deal with big projects that we really want to get done, such as the boardwalk.
I would agree.
I think it makes sense not to put the 100,000
Back in.
in for the boardwalk. Well, yeah, for the historical, I think we should just sit tight on with 25, so we have operating expenses.
Right.
But the other 125, just leave it for right now. Don't pay it back right now, knowing it needs to go back.
Right.
But that isn't something that is a real high priority. I think the boardwalk, if we take the 100,000 out, correct me if I'm wrong, if we take it out of the budget, then we'll have a surplus of about 85,000, which I think we should put in a reserve tagged for the boardwalk. But I'd like to see a bit of what it's really gonna cost.
Right.
I don't think we can say how much money we're going to put toward it until we have an idea of what it's gonna cost.
Yeah, I agree. Council can't really make a commitment to spend X dollars against what?
Yeah.
It would just be idle.
But if we put it in reserve,
Right.
it tells people that
And
it's still
available.
very important to us, not that we're wrong yet. We just don't know
Yeah.
how much we can do at this point. So I think it makes sense.
So the priority there would be to get out for bids.
to get it done.
Yep. So that would bring us to about an $85,000 surplus. And then, as mentioned, when we discussed earlier, we caught the whole operating supplies for parks. It was a holdover from the 2022 proposed budget at $35,000. We can take away $17,000, so 15, whatever, be at about $100,000 surplus for the year, because we don't need to spend that money. And there's a couple other things that we saw here and there, I think, with the city manager.
yeah, there's
PTO.
just a couple, truthfully, just errors, small errors. It doesn't amount to $500 here, whatnot, but
Right.
by doing it this way, if you remember, we were roughly $100,000 in a deficit situation when we made the transfer from the historical fund. Village passed, we're looking at it now. Okay, I was expecting to see a good, to the good.
Right.
Because it did free up money for these other things. So yes, I would say if we go that route, at the end of the year when we do our audit, I will take whatever that surplus may be up to the 100 grand. And just reserve fund balance for the boardwalk, so it's sitting there for when we do get to do it. And then council can decide if it comes in at $1.5 million. We don't know what we're gonna do at that point.
And that will coincide with us bringing a policy on capital reserves policy too.
And I'm very much in support of putting those policies in place. I think they'll really help. They'll help with our financial position, they'll also help with clarity on the budget as we go forward. You won't have all those variations in there. The other item that I had asked about, and we had said we would bring up tonight, was the $40,000 window repair,
Right.
window replacement.
Yep.
At Ford Park. Without an overall plan for that building, I'm not sure why we would commit that kind of money.
Yeah, and the reason, so I did some asking, the reason is there was a plan at one point to use that building in the wintertime, so it was losing a lot of heat in the wintertime. So when you open the windows and it's hard to, it takes two people to actually open those windows. So it's, those windows they're outdated. However, when the plan was to use that building, for parks purposes in the wintertime, to keep it open, you would want to keep the heat on, you'd be losing heat. So, but right now, Rachel says there's no need at this point to use it for the winter. So I think we can agree to take that off the.
Absolutely.
Well, and there's a recurring topic about what to do with Fort Park in general.
Right.
As it relates to operations and parking. So a place for the supervisor to be, I wouldn't spend that money right now.
So we could minus, that's the waterfront budget.
Waterfront fund, but yeah.
Waterfront. Capital outlay.
Right.
Now, the only thing other than any changes that you might all have over and above and beyond that. Between now and next week. If there is something major that comes up that would change any of the amended 2022. I will have to bring that back. So if something came up and we needed to spend 100 grand that by the end of this year, that totally is unexpected, that would change the amended budget. And I just don't want to be able to not come and say, look, this is what happened and here's why. I need to change this number for this purpose. Doesn't happen often, but it has happened.
Yeah, we can go.
Just because I just got a call this afternoon on our patrol car. Well, I don't know if that's going to affect the 2022.
I kind of put a little money for that purpose, but it depends on what you tell me, how much it is tomorrow.
I get the bill from him, but he just called me this afternoon at like 5 o'clock.
Are you talking about $100,000?
No, it's not that. It might be 12 or something like that, but I don't want to.
January 10th.
He just won't, if it's 100 grand, he just won't get paid till that first of the year.
So I think those are changes I think we could easily make.
Absolutely. I mean, it flows through all these back supporting documents. It'll take me a couple hours to thread them through there, but
Well, that was my punch list.
Yeah, Victor answered most of my questions earlier, so, which all made sense. We're all in agreement with the fund transfers and stuff like that, so. I think we're going in the right direction.
Yeah, I think trying to build up that reserve fund is the best thing we've thought of in a long time.
And we're finally in a position to do that.
Right.
well, the intent was, from the forefathers here, it's not that they didn't ever intend to do that because we had a healthy fund balance and we still are maintaining that, trying. But I'd rather have it spelled out. We want X amount of dollars for 20 years from now, resurface the boardwalk or put a roof on,
Pay the parking
to
lot.
know that we're there and not have to go back to the taxpayers and say,
Correct me if I'm wrong, we're kind of in this predicament because of the spillway or whatever.
That's,
Wasn't
that's
that part of the reason?
that's part of the other part, and not to get back on this topic, but the fact that Helia has had, right? We can't adjust our millage, supposedly, we can't adjust our millage rate. So for example, 15 years ago, if we needed to do an extra expense on a capital project, the council would come together and say, all right, we're gonna raise the millage a $0.5 up so we can, do this project.
and then
They had that
back
And I
up.
bring it back down.
Then bring it back down when that capital project was done. But we don't have that, we didn't have that flexibility until this millage was passed. Now it's a little more easier to do that. But back then, they didn't have to worry so much about creating a reserve balance because they could just adjust the millage rate up and down as they please.
And in the last few years, we've just been taking money out of
The reserve.
reserve fund or general. fund
General fund.
As we ran into problems.
Why do you think the boardwalk is a priority, you know, one way or the other, so.
From a general fund perspective, yeah.
I don't think we can go another year or two without getting that. I think heads would roll if we don't get that figured out.
Is the 125 to the historical fund, does that have to go back in one lump sum?
No,
So we actually used to have, up until this last year, made a monthly transfer internally in our bookkeeping so that we could make payroll and when that was operating. So now they still, even after the 125,000, that fund still has a fund balance and some cash. We just have to be very cognizant if tree falls on it, we gotta figure it out.
yeah, we know, on a year, we can also want to do 25,000 a year, 50,000 a year. That's how.
Well, but that'll come out of the negotiation with the historical society, right?
Right.
That's for the operating, but as far as the reserve.
Or the
yeah,
payback
yeah,
reserve.
Yeah,
Because we still have to maintain the building.
yeah,
Right.
it's our build, we own the building.
They're just gonna operate it.
Yep.
So what do you need from us?
I don't think we need I think this is enough direction as long as there's consensus on that direction. Which I think there is, to go make those adjustments, and then we'll bring it back December 19th with a resolution.
Two resolutions.
Two resolutions, well, for the CIP, the budget, and a bunch of other documents, and then we'll have a lot of other fun stuff on the December 19th agenda. We don't have a meeting the first Monday in January, that's January 2nd is a city holiday, because it falls on a Sunday, New Year's. So we'll have our first we'll only have one meeting in January. Basically, which would be the 16th, I think. Yeah. And so that usually what that means when we have meetings like that is we try to put as much on the December 9th, that last agenda, so things gotta get done, so we don't wait till a month later to do them.
Well, thank you for all the good work. This is a major effort.
Take some time.
You did a good job as always.
Especially when you're out for a week, being sick.
We gotta put a lot of pressure.
Right.
Yes, Victor, before the next meeting, are we gonna get some information on the planning, on the commissions that need to be filled?
Yeah, I will send out that we only have had 3 applications new, in addition to the people who are existing appointed, so you'll get that information, yeah. I think what you've asked for last year was their attendance record, basically the existing ones.
As best as you can, how long they've been on.
Yeah.
And that kind of stuff. Great.
As far as reappointing people, do we have to? Do they fill out a new application?
No, we don't. For the people who are we don't have them fill out a new application. I
What
mean,
if they don't have an application on, because it's been so long, if they've been on, it's just a question.
we don't, I've never had a policy for that. We're actually trying to create the boards and commissions through the RRC committee. We're trying to get
Yeah,
something to bring to council for that. We've never had a policy for that and for expectations and qualifications. So maybe not for this year, but maybe something we can think about for next year for people. If we want to have them refill out. Theoretically, the idea is they've been on the boards and council should be kind of paying attention to how those members participate and judge their performance based on, anything like that. That's a theory, but obviously there's a lot of boards and commissions. You don't have time to sit there and look at it. Right. All right. I don't think there's anything else on the agenda.
So,
Nope.
any new or old business?
No, that's not on the agenda.
No.
I'm just-
No.
We were done.
Check the box. Check the box. All right. Well, if there's nothing further, I'm gonna say this meeting adjourned. Thank you for coming.
thanks.